Greetings, this is Greg. I'm going to answer more of the questions and address comments from the chat during my debate with Mr. Marshall. Keep in mind, I couldn't see those questions or comments during the debate. Only the viewers and moderator could. I have a lot to go through, so I'll be shooting from the hip on these. Don't expect me to fire off specific dates or model numbers. I'm just painting here with a wide brush. For those who don't know, the debate was about the lack of fighter escorts for U.S. heavy bombers over Europe in 1943. My contention is that it was entirely due to the bomber mafia dropping the ball. Mr. Marshall contends it was due to technical complications. I'm not going to respond to every question or comment here. There are just too many, but I'll do what I can. Let's get into this. So why no steel drop tanks? Well, there certainly were steel drop tanks, a lot of them, and by various nations. But the question might be asking why the aversion to steel drop tanks. One of the many barriers the bomber mafia, and in this case, I guess that really means the USAAF leadership, one of the many barriers they put up to drop tank development and production is saying, don't make them out of steel, which is why the U.S. developed all of these other materials, paper mache and so forth, to make drop tanks out of. Ultimately, they ended up settling on steel because it really is the way to go. But their stated reason for this aversion to steel drop tanks was because they would ignite very easily if hit by enemy fire. And that was true. One P-47 even shot itself down, strafing an island in the Pacific. The new pilot, who was practicing strafing, wasn't even in combat, caught a ricochet, lit the plane on fire. The fire spread before he figured it out and had to bail out. The plane was lost. There's also gun camera footage, not of P-47s getting hit, but of fighter planes getting hit and the drop tanks igniting. So that was a real risk. The thing is, normally, if you're carrying a drop tank, you're going to drop it as soon as you see an enemy aircraft. So when planes get hit in the drop tank, it's usually because they're being bounced by an unseen enemy. And in that case, those fighters are usually getting shot down anyway. So I don't think there's a big additional risk of carrying a steel drop tank versus some other material. Furthermore, it's a war. Risk management is largely what it's all about. Would you rather lose a few P-47s or a few fighter planes because they're carrying steel drop tanks, or would you rather lose 60 B-17s in one day because you don't have an adequate drop tank there in the first place? I think the answer to that is self-evident. Lawrence, my understanding, Lindbergh helped the Cactus Air Force with the mileage they needed to shoot down Yamamoto. Well, Lindbergh certainly helped with range in the Pacific Theater. No question about that. In fact, that's a very interesting discussion and one that, to my knowledge, has never been really thoroughly discussed on YouTube. There have been some things that have given it a general overview, but there's a lot about that that's not commonly known. I'll probably make a video about that at some point. But that was after the Yamamoto mission. So while the Lindbergh part of your statement is true, and P-38 certainly did chase and shoot down Yamamoto, those two things were unrelated. Nick, Greg, ease up. Nick, I kind of am eased up. I realize I come across as pretty intense, and my wife actually, after she watched the video, watched the debate, she said the same thing, that I should have tried to ease up and come off a little less intense. But, you know, I can be an intense person. I know some of you guys saw the video where that guy Ruben, who's a complete idiot, tried to falsify some records with a car and cover up damage that he had caused, and I got pretty ticked off at him, and I was going to pick him up and throw him in the river, and my son came out and made sure I didn't do that, and then my son-in-law's out there filming the whole thing. The cops show up. It was a whole big deal. And I mean, nobody got arrested or hurt. It's not like that kind of big deal, but in any case, my son-in-law Toby is very creative. He took clips of that and made a kind of funny video on YouTube. It's called the Reuben Chronicles or Quest for Justice or some such thing. I don't know. Anyway, that video's out there. I can be pretty intense, no question about that. But I do really like Mr. Marshall. I got to say, he's one of the sharpest guys out there, and he probably is literally the most knowledgeable guy out there within certain fields, P-51 Mustang development, for example. I just don't agree with him on this range thing, and I feel pretty strongly about this. And yeah, that comes up, that comes out, just the way it is. But yeah, I'll try and be better, Nick. Thanks. Joey, glad you're here. Chris Fahey. Chris Fahey, for those of you who don't know, I've mentioned this before. He is a real warbird pilot in the modern world. I believe he's an airline pilot, but then also flies P-38s, among other things. I know him from the videos on YouTube where he's flying the P-38. So it's internal fuel that determines combat radius. Absolutely true. Well, I mean, there are exceptions to everything, but generally speaking, yes. You're going to fly out outbound on the mission mostly on the fuel in your drop tanks. Once that's exhausted, you're going to drop them. So your ability to get home, the distance you can go, is limited by how much internal fuel you have, minus whatever you're going to use in combat and whatever you're going to keep for reserves. And when you run all those numbers, a 305-gallon internal fuel P-47, which pretty much means any Razorback, is going to be limited to about 450 miles, regardless of the drop tanks you have. Whether you have a single 220, a single 215, twin 108s, or even twin 165s, so that's a lot of gas. With any of those, your range, your combat radius, I should say, is still limited to about 450 miles. That's a good number. It's also a very conservative number. That number can be found in all sorts of Air Force documentation, and if you factor in really ideal conditions, you can go out beyond that. And sometimes they did go a bit beyond that, but 450 miles is a very good combat radius number for a P-47 with adequate drop tanks. Now, the exception would be there are some cases where they put a drop tank that's obviously way too small for a Thunderbolt, like a single 75-gallon drop tank. Then your radius will not be limited by internal fuel. It's limited by not having enough drop tank, but that's due to a mistake, not a general principle. The principle Chris Fahey is stating here is correct, and the 450-mile number is a very good number. I don't disagree with that at all. John McGuire, this isn't even about drop tanks. The question that needs to be asked is, what's the opinion on fighter, or he is asking, what was the opinion on fighter escorts in general at the time? That's a very good question, and it also sort of makes a good point, which might be John's intent here. I'm not sure about that. First of all, the debate is about drop tanks, but there is a greater question, or perhaps a greater question, of why were escort fighters not developed in the first place, and then the range of those escort fighters further enhanced by drop tanks. It's a very valid question, and the reason is because the bomber mafia wasn't particularly interested in escort fighters. They paid lip service to the idea, they wrote documents and things, but you have to judge politicians and bureaucrats by what they do or don't do, not by what they say. And a general in the military is absolutely a person with significant bureaucratic and political skill. So you just can't judge them by what they wrote down. Oh, we really want to make escort fighters, but we just can't think of a way to do it right now. They'll say things like that. But look at what they did. They designed the YB-40, an escort bomber. They put resources into that over escort fighters or drop tanks. And if I ask you to point to an escort fighter of World War II, you're probably going to point to the P-51 Mustang, but that wasn't the result of U.S. Army Air Force leadership. That came about entirely another way, sort of a roundabout thing involving the British. The U.S. was never really serious about an escort fighter prior to World War II. And so John McGuire's question here actually makes a very good point. Call me Stan. Hey, Stan. Chris Fahey again. Pacific ranges weren't much further. Okay, that's true. Now we're talking about Razorback Thunderbolts at this point. Again, 305 gallons internal and various different drop tank configurations. And the missions flown in the Pacific theater were generally about the same ranges as missions that were flown or could have been flown in the European theater. Next statement, but their mission profiles were much different. Well, they're two different theaters, so of course they're not a perfect apples-to-apples comparison, but by the same token, no two missions are a perfect apple-to-apple comparison. If you have two missions in the European theater, there are different variables for each one. No two missions are the same either. But when you're talking about range, there are certain big picture things that are the same and thus will offer valid comparisons. For example, Razorback Thunderbolts were escorting B-24s in both theaters. B-24s going comparable distances to well-defended targets. There were enemy fighters in both cases. They're not the same fighters, of course, but they're both fighters that present a threat to the Thunderbolts. And the Thunderbolts were flying in the 24 to 28,000 foot range when they're on those escort missions in both cases. Yeah, there are missions that are different, but those big picture things that we use to talk about range are in many cases, enough cases to use for valid comparisons. So I'll get into this more in another video. In fact, I have 2 whole videos on Pacific Theater Thunderbolt stuff coming up, which I think is going to be very interesting. Just another consumer asks or says, given that the Spokane Sun God, 1929, was history by this point, air-to-air refueling wasn't exactly a future idea. Well, it wasn't a future idea. People had been thinking about air-to-air refueling for quite a while, and yes, the Spokane Sun God, that's an airplane, did that in 1929. It flew, I think, if I remember right, it was all around the U.S. It wasn't across an ocean or something. And it stayed in the air via air-to-air refueling. However, that was certainly not an option for U.S. aircraft over Europe. I don't know this for sure because I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to modern aviation stuff, but modern military aviation stuff. But I seriously doubt that even today the U.S. Air Force does air-to-air refueling in areas in which they do not have total air superiority. In other words, they're not going to fly over enemy territory and do air-to-air refueling then. So even with modern air-to-air refueling capability, I don't think you could refuel an entire formation of P-47s, 36 or 48 airplanes, something like that, over enemy territory. Furthermore, the technology wasn't there. The Spokane Sun God is an airplane that flies around at very low speed. I don't even remember what type of airplane it is, but it's something that's probably putting around at 90 or 100 miles an hour. And the way they did that fueling was the tanker aircraft just dropped a hose out of it, and the Spokane Sun God's pilot, it had a crew on board. It was at least two people, I don't remember. But anyway, one person would fly the plane over, and the other person would climb out of the top of the airplane and grab that hose and refuel the airplane like you're refueling your car, but in 90-mile-an-hour winds. That's just not doable in a P-47. So that may not be the point he's making, though. I'm looking at these questions after the fact, and I don't know what was going on in the debate at this point. But air-to-air refueling was not an option to extend the range of fighters over Europe. But yes, air-to-air refueling did exist at the time. Notice the next thing says Greg's airplanes and automobiles questions will come soon. Keep asking them. That is actually not me. That's the moderator that is typing in my stead here because I'm on the other side of the screen. I don't see these questions coming up. Just another consumer. So the fighter or not fighter seems a more important question than drop tank or not drop tank. Maybe. The difference is that the fighter or not fighter is very much a theoretical question. Could they have built a long-range escort fighter in 1941? Had they started it in 1938 or something? Well, maybe. That's something that would really be an entirely different discussion and a much more complicated discussion. It's, I think, very easy to make it clear that designing a drop tank after the fact was not a problem, and that's the argument I'm making. Jim, technology. I thought Andrew was moderate. I don't know what that means. They should have called in the Stratotankers. Maybe Bill should drop his resolution down to 720p. Okay, I realized that Bill was having issues with resolution and audio, and if we ever do this again, that's all going to be rock solid and fixed up better. But understand it would not have been possible to get Bill to have done that during the debate. You don't understand how much work the moderator had to do to make this happen in the first place. All right, they had the technology. I get it, the $6 Million Man reference. Moving on. All right, let's go to the next page. Chris Fahey says it was the 370-gallon internal fuel tank that allowed the D-25 bubble top to go 650 miles over Europe. I'm paraphrasing that. Yes, Mr. Fahey, that is entirely correct. I suspect that he's responding to something that was said during the debate, backing up either Mr. Marshall or I don't know, but the statement is 100% true. The P-47 D-25 and all later D models had 370 gallons nominally of internal fuel and bubble tops, and they could go out farther than the previous Thunderbolts, which only had 305 gallons of internal fuel. Absolutely true. Remy Brooks Johnson says, Bill, what is stopping engineers who design the turbo supercharging system designing drop tanks, which is much simpler if given the go-ahead? Yeah, that's a good point. I know he's asking Bill. I'll tackle this myself. Of course, the engineers that design a high-altitude, high-speed, turbo and supercharged fighter plane can handle designing a drop tank. Not only can they did. Republic designed at least 3 different drop tanks for the P-47, and I say all the time, but it's true. Republic's records were destroyed in 1987, so we don't get the whole story, but we know for sure that they designed at least 3 different drop tanks for the Thunderbolt. So There was nothing stopping them. However, what they couldn't do was force the USAAF to develop a doctrine to use them or to purchase them and put them into production. That was the actual problem. I'm going to skip the next couple of them. John McGuire, Greg needs to address when was the first time a P-47 could fly the same mission with provisions for drop tanks. The same as what? This is another problem of he's probably responding to something in the debate. I'm not quite sure what that is. When did Republic's airplane have the capability and a tank? September of 1942. That's the answer to that. I don't know the actual day. I'm shooting from the hip on this, but in September of 1942, from that point on, all P-47 Thunderbolts could carry a drop tank. Whether the drop tank was in theater or in production was an issue, but the airplane had the capability to do it, and Republic had designed and tested to some extent 3 different tanks at that point. Greg, proving a conspiracy is a lot harder than simply stating it. Well, I'm not simply stating anything. Where are the documents proving high-level intent not to escort the bombers? I think you're misrepresenting my argument here. First of all, the Bomber Mafia was not engaged in a conspiracy early on, and they were not intending not to escort the bombers specifically. They went in various stages here. They were doing what they truly believed was right initially, which was promoting the idea and pushing for unescorted large formations of self-defending bombers. In other words, they were self-escorting. Then they went from self-escorting to saying, well, we need more heavily armed non-bomb carrying bombers. In other words, bomber escorts instead of fighter escorts to go with the bombers, and they developed the YB-40. So the proof that they intended to do that is in a number of things. One, the lack of effort in developing an escort fighter, the lack of effort in developing drop tanks, in fact, interference in developing drop tanks, which is easily provable, and the very existence of the YB-40. Unless you're going to argue that the YB-40 was less expensive than putting drop tanks on the P-47, or more effective than putting drop tanks on the P-47, or easier, less of an engineering challenge than putting drop tanks on a P-47, then the very existence of the YB-40 proves all of this. Although I don't agree with the term conspiracy, that implies that they're deliberately doing something wrong, like they're getting kickbacks from Boeing or Consolidated or something. I'm not saying that at all. I truly believe Hap Arnold was doing what he thought was the right thing and was going to lead to a quicker victory in the war. The treachery and deceit part comes after that, where they created this cover story saying, oh, well, the P-47 never could have done it. We couldn't do it until the P-51 showed up. It's just nonsense. Moving on, didn't they put paper tanks on the P-51? Why couldn't the P-47 carry a paper tank? Yes, they did put paper tanks on the P-51, and the P-47 Thunderbolt could and did carry tanks made out of compressed paper. They're not too desirable, though, because, well, there are a whole bunch of reasons, and we'll get into that in another video. The metal tanks, as a general rule, were better, but the papier-mâché tanks are kind of cool in their own way, and I do like them. Moving on, the only civilian aircraft I know of with pressurized tanks are Falcon 20s. Most everything else didn't. Airheaded Aviator here is talking about tanks with a significant amount of pressurization, like a World War II drop tank, or a lot of the internal tanks in World War II as well, but for sure the drop tanks. The modern airliners have tanks that are under very slight positive pressure, usually less than 1 psi, and that pressure is usually provided by a NACA duct. There's not some mechanism pressurizing it. But they're not pressurized in the way that World War II drop tanks are. I'll deal with that a little more in the next video, in which I get into the technical aspect of drop tanks using the Pacific Theater examples. All right, the next one is from Andrew, the moderator, who's posting as me in this case, which is a good job. All right, moving on. Okay, just another consumer. Some of it may come down to wanting the Jug for other duties, close air support, and so pushing other planes to escort duty. Well, not over the Third Reich in 1943. That was way before the Thunderbolt was really needed seriously in that area for close air support. Plus, there really wasn't another plane available in this case, meaning in theater, ready for action. The Mustangs didn't come in until really early 1944, January generally, and the P-38s had been sent to Africa. So using the jug for other duties. No, it needed to be used for escort at that point. Dennis Mason, paper mache fuel tanks, Britain to the rescue. That's absolutely correct. And the British did sort of save the day on some shorter range missions with their 108-gallon paper mache fuel tank. And I really like that fuel tank, and there's a lot of good reasons to like it. But in the Thunderbolt, it's going to take 2 of them to get it to the targets that are halfway into Germany, like Schweinfurt. With dual 108s, you could go to Schweinfurt, but that wasn't an option in 1943, at least not when the Schweinfurt raids happened, because you had to have a belly tank that could do the job, and you can only put one of those things on the belly. Fella, this is why I like watching Greg. He knows always what. Yeah, okay, thanks. Appreciate that. Dr. Fatal Chunk, Greg, why did the Bomber Mafia initially believe unescorted bombers were superior? Well, this all started in the mid-1930s. There was a period during which bombers were very, very difficult to intercept. The technology in bombers had leaped ahead of fighters. They hadn't figured out how to make high-speed, high-altitude fighters quite as quickly as they did with the bombers. And there was a period of time when turbocharged B-17s were going to be very difficult or nearly impossible to intercept by the fighters of the day. So that's how that started. And then they built on that with the idea that large, tight formations would have so much defensive fighter power that the fighters wouldn't be able to be effective against them. So that was where that came from. And then they sort of dug their heels in and became entrenched in that position and only slowly gave up ground on that. Then they thought, well, okay, we're losing bombers, but it's only because our formations aren't big enough. Or, well, we're losing bombers, but we need to have a few more heavily escorted, aka YB-40, more heavily armed, I should say, bombers within that formation. And then it was, well, we need fighters, but only to escort through the enemy fighter belt. From that point on, deep into Germany and back, the bombers are going to be okay. So they sort of kept giving up ground until in November of 1943. They just had to recant totally and say, okay, we need fighter escorts. All right, moving on. Cessna has a note, even in the 172, vapor bubbles are more likely above 5,000 feet. Swift fuels, this was even worse when running motor gas because of fuel vapor pressure ratings. That's probably true. I don't know that to be true specifically, but in terms of automotive gas, those fuel vapor pressure ratings change all the time and also vary from one region to another. And it creates a huge problem in the automotive world, which is a discussion for another time, but that problem has to do with the emissions canisters, the vapor purge systems, and also there are problems with mechanical fuel bumps bolted to the hot engine block in older cars with newer fuels. I mean, this is a whole automotive discussion that I could really get into, but let's move on. Nick Danger, Bill is breaking up. I know. Chili Billy, glad you're here. Turlagon, I guess. I don't know. Hey, so what about the pressure of other liquid in high altitude interceptors? Well, the cooling system in the case of the 38 and 51 is under pressure. The oil systems in all of them, of course, are under pressure. I mean, we're not running Babbitt bearings here, so all of that stuff is under pressure, and quite a bit of it. I'm not sure specifically what you're asking me. Dennis Mason, because the Bomber Mafia was, well, there were definitely some egomaniacs in there, but again, I want to stress that, we're talking about Hap Arnold and Ira Eaker, who are the people that I lay most of the blame on here. They felt they were doing the right thing. They were trying to win the war. My problem with them is that they held on to their flawed ideals way too long, and then they came up with a cover story, which I really don't like. And Republic, of course, went along with that cover story because they wanted to sell F-84s. They had their own plan too. All right, moving on. Just another consumer, very active commenter. I like that. Fatal territorialism in government is common. If your department is bombers, fighters are something that's taking funding and promotion opportunities away from you. Absolutely true. I do think that was a factor. Moving on, I don't see debates about World War II airplanes. This is cool. Well, thanks. If the P-47 escorted long in other theaters, that's the debate wrapped, right? Well, I think so, yes. I think the fact that in the Pacific Theater they designed, tested, and used the Brisbane tank, which was good up to 28,000 feet, and escorted out to 450 miles with that, and developed that tank very quickly, that proves that could have been done as well in the European theater. I will provide more evidence of that and absolutely, just beat on that subject extensively in the next video, which is really about P-47 range in the Pacific. And the one that's after that, which will follow very shortly after, like hopefully a matter of days, will cover the actual missions flown that provide further proof. I think that's a nail in the coffin to the whole idea that P-47s couldn't have escorted in Europe. But I think it's only one of many things that are there. Even without that, it's provable. Moving along, at Fatal Chunk basically saved their butts for years by banging the drum that bombers didn't need to be escorted. That's true. They did bang the drum saying that bombers didn't need to be escorted. If they admitted they were wrong, well, where would their careers be? Well, what they did is shift the blame. They said, well, it's not so much that the bombers didn't need escort, it's that we didn't have any choice. There was nothing out there that could have done it. When, in fact, the reason the P-47 couldn't do it in Europe was because of the bad decisions they had made, so they were covering their butts that way. That is the deceit and treachery part, which I am displeased with. And that's important even today. You need to be conscious of the fact that what you're being told is not necessarily what happened. You cannot judge politicians and bureaucrats by what they say. You have to look at what they do. I think every adult watching these videos knows that. JP, if Bill would drop his camera, yeah, good luck. Audio problems, I know. Paul Woodman, is pilot availability an issue for escort fighters? Not for the United States. We had amazingly effective pilot training. Effective in terms of cranking out numbers of skilled pilots. Not effective in terms of safety. I mean, our training machine was killing a lot of people, wrecking a lot of airplanes. But in terms of numbers, getting people to the front that were competent and capable of flying those airplanes, yeah. The U.S. was very good at that, and pilot availability was never a problem. Just another consumer. Maybe we need to get the right audio out of paper and get the right pump. Yeah, that is funny. You could make drop tanks out of paper. It wasn't the best way necessarily, but it did work. And the proper fuel pump, which Republic had, was critical for getting altitude out of an unpressurized tank. And I discussed that in the debate, and I will absolutely be putting up proof of that in the very next video. No need to go into it now. Dennis Mason, those jugs beat the crap out of the Luftwaffe anyway. Well, they did. I will say the Luftwaffe put up a heck of a good fight considering what they were up against. They've got to fight at low altitude on one front, high altitude on the other, against vastly different types of enemies in different conditions. The Luftwaffe put up a heck of a fight, but ultimately they were in a no-win situation. This is something people talk about all the time. Oh, Hitler did this, and that's why he lost the war. And, well, that's a very arrogant way to look at things. That's sort of saying that, well, if I was in charge, the Germans would have won. No, they wouldn't have. You would have lost too. Once the U.S. entered the war, there is no way the Germans could have won. The Germans had to win that war before U.S. entry. And I could certainly argue that they had some opportunities to do that, but that's not what this channel's about, so let's just move on. Audio thing, yeah, I get it. These guys, classy, intelligent, knowledge-based debate. Thank you. I plan to tell my wife someone said I'm classy and intelligent. Eric, yeah, I get it about the audio. Let's move on. M. Peugeot, it's a French car. Some of them are decent cars. Internet should not be provisioned over 2 tin cups and a string. Yeah, I don't know. 2 tin cups and a string works. We just couldn't arrange it that way. Airheaded Aviator, if that was their priority, then we wouldn't have had the losses we did. Yes, if the Bomber Mafia had prioritized escort fighters earlier, to even a small extent to which they prioritized unescorted bombers, our losses in 1943 would have been much lower. Another audio thing, I get that. The problem is the Bomber Mafia could not admit the losses were resulting from decisions they made. Yeah, I agree. Greg's audio is good. Thank you. And we got Andrew saying, great questions, keep them coming. And Andrew did try to get a lot of these questions to us in the debate, but I counted them up afterwards, and there were 500, which is why I'm going through these in multiple videos. This is the second one, and we're not going to be halfway through them all. Matt says, is it just me, or is Greg's argument they either got in the way or were slack as hell? Yes, that is my argument, except it's actually both of those things. The Bomber Mafia very often got in the way of drop tank development and also were slack as hell in regards to providing fighter escort, meaning the airplanes, the tanks, developing a doctrine to use them. They put everything in the wrong baskets, and then were way too slow to realize it. So I would call that being slack as hell, I suppose. Mr. Marshall's rebuttal is, why would they do something wrong? That's not an argument. Well, that's an oversimplification of Mr. Marshall's argument. Mr. Marshall's argument is that the bomber mafia, I mean, it's one of his arguments. He has many. One of them, and it's valid, is that why would the bomber mafia intentionally do something that would torpedo their whole thing, which was bombing the Reich at this point? Well, it's a bit of a straw man argument. I'm not saying they did this intentionally. They did this because they thought it was the right thing to do. Again, this is confusion over what I meant by deceit and treachery. The deceit and treachery came after the mistakes. Asks Bill, of course I'll have to answer it. Didn't they put paper tanks on the P-51? Why couldn't the P-47 carry a paper tank? Somebody else asked this earlier. Yes, they did put P-51s out there with paper tanks on them, and the P-47 could and did carry paper tanks. They could have done it earlier, but they did it. Nick Danger, RAF heavies were operating in daylight. Nick has a lot of really good points. I see him in my channel commenting all the time. Good guy. Yes, that is true. Turlog Han, how oil coolant, etc. are changing in high altitude flight. How did these aspects affect the use of these fluids in long range high altitude flights? I sort of touched on that earlier. I think that he's asking the same question twice or more or less. Coolant is pressurized to, if I'm just doing this from memory, roughly 12 psi, let's say, in a World War II cooling system. And oil, of course, is under a lot of pressure because we have pressurized lubricant. Once again, we're not running Babbitt bearings in World War II airplanes, at least not any that I know of. So the characteristics of those things change a little bit with altitude, but not enough to matter. That's not something you need to plan for. Question for Bill, if Arnold wasn't to blame, who should we blame instead? I'd hate to speak for Bill, but he's not here, so I'm going to say he's probably going to say Republic Aircraft. I am going to say it was Hap Arnold. Hap Arnold was the top of the food chain in the bomber mafia and overall in the U.S. Army Air Corps and later Army Air Force and later in the Air Force. So I blame Hap Arnold. There are a few other people I blame as well, but again, he's at the top of that list. Moving on, Count Bugulus, it sounds to me there's a timeline disconnect about this argument. I think a lot of the arguments Bill is making are true, but didn't come about until later in the war. They changed their minds. Well, yes, Bill says a lot of things that are true. It's the overall effect of all of these decisions and things that happen and reasons for them that we don't agree on. For example, we both agree that P-47s were not escorting deep into Germany in 1943. We disagree about the reasons for that. Your last sentence here is that they changed their minds, meaning the bomber mafia changed their minds. Yes, that's true. And thus, after a certain point, the bomber mafia became entirely accepting of the idea that they needed escort fighters. But that happened in small changes. They slowly changed their mind over time. All right, Andrew, our moderator, who has his own channel, Flightline Media, you guys really need to check that out. I don't understand why that channel's not doing better. The guy's doing God's work over there. Anyway, just to catch up, Greg is arguing that P-47's initial short range is the fault of the Air Force brass. Bill says it's primarily Republic's fault. That's an excellent summary there, Andrew. Camera rate not happening. Dennis points out the P-47 did carry drop tanks. Correct. Ian Prinzing, excellent point. I wish I knew what you were saying that in reference to. M. Peugeot. You could just say Peugeot. Probably nobody's used that username. I'm just guessing. The range of the P-38 was greatly extended by adjusting the mixture. Yeah, that's right. I really need to make that video about that. It's a lot more, though, than just adjusting the mixture. It's using what were at the time very unconventional power settings related to manifold pressure and RPM and other things. For example, in some extreme cases, they would even, once they were safe, at a point where they were no longer going to encounter the enemy, they would even fire all of their ammunition to lighten the airplane. They had a lot of range extending techniques that pilots were using in the Pacific. Moving on, Jeffrey Hopkins, my 38 years of being involved in Army aviation puts me squarely on the side of Greg on this one. Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I have worked for 2 Air Force generals at 2 different airlines, and I hope they're not all like that. Ian Prinzing, YB-40 was a terrible idea. Okay, this must be what he's talking about earlier when he said excellent point. Terrible idea, much more difficult than solving any comparatively minor difficulties of the P-47. Yeah, that's exactly right. The very existence, let alone usage, of the YB-40 and prioritizing that over drop tanks for the P-47 really more than anything else ends this argument, although even without that, there's tons of evidence for my side of the debate. Let's change pages here and move on. Tom McGuire says, I'm so mad at this moderator. Well, don't be. Don't be mad at Andrew. Let's consider a few things here. Andrew's got to deal with myself and Mr. Marshall, which in this environment are probably not the two easiest people to deal with. Not because that they were rude or spewing profanity, anything like that. That certainly wasn't the case. But we both have a lot to say, vastly more to say than we can fit in to the time allotment. So Andrew really has his hands full managing us and our time and what we're allowed to respond to and not and so forth. And that's a problem. This is a very challenging debate to moderate. Add to that the technical problems that Andrew has to deal with and the avalanche of comments coming in. And he's got to read every one because he's got to prioritize those. Obviously, if it's a super chat, he has to let us know about that because we have to address those. Those are people that literally paid to be at the party. And as for all of the other comments, he wants to get the ones to us that he feels are especially relevant. He's a judgment call there, of course. So Andrew has his hands full, and I'm, as a fellow aviator, because Andrew is also an airline pilot, I am very proud of the work he did here. So please don't be mad at him. All right. At M. Peugeot, Red Max says, fuel in England was also not so good for the 38. They had engine problems constantly. Yeah, that's true. Those problems were overcome, but they did have those problems. Mind blown watcher, I would think the original Army Air Force specs for the aircraft not having long-range tanks is a telling point. It certainly is a telling point. That is exactly right. The fact that there was no real effort put into long-range escort during the development phase of most of the World War II fighters is indeed very telling. Chicken Jante, I guess that's how you say that. Yeah, exactly. Andrew's doing great. M. Peugeot, shitty fuel was a choice, maybe a necessary choice, still a choice. I just don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't think I do. But I don't want to go off on a whole fuel tangent because I can really get going there. Just another consumer, even if they're just using tanks, I think he means drop tanks, to get up and climb, etc., the threat environment should be moot. Well, I would never quite say it's moot. I mean, the Germans were tricky. They would show up in places that you wouldn't necessarily predict. But yes, generally speaking, the drop tanks are going to be used until you have an enemy aircraft in sight. Although earlier in the war, they would only use them until they reached the enemy coast, and they would drop them then, which was a mistake. Tom, who is Andrew? And then Andrew answers that. He's the guy in the blue shirt, co-founder of Flightline Media. Yeah, exactly. No smoking. All right, let's move on. John McGuire, did fighters escort the bombers on shorter missions? Yes. Did the bomber Mafia want fighters when the range was not an issue? Well, it would be career suicide to put out a note saying, no, we don't want fighters at all, or, absolutely do not send the fighters with the bombers to the limits of their range. So as far as I know, that never happened. Spitfires were the escort fighter of choice before the Thunderbolts got there, and they couldn't really go far enough to do much good because the Luftwaffe, being very familiar with Spitfires at this point, would hang back outside of the Spitfire's range and thus attack the bombers once they were unescorted. But yes, they were sending fighters with the bombers to the limits of their range pretty much the whole time. I don't think the Bomber Mafia had any choice in that. They're not going to put out a memo saying when the bombers are flying, don't operate fighters in the area. That just wasn't going to happen. The fighter guys would have had a mutiny. All right, Turlogon and internal oil and coolant capacity, I suppose. He's talking about range limiting of fuels, I believe. Coolant capacity, to my knowledge, was never range limiting in a World War II fighter. There are certain airplanes that had total loss cooling systems earlier on where that would be the case. But World War II fighter, no. Unless the fighter develops a leak in the cooling system from mechanical failure or battle damage maybe or something else, the coolant capacity is not going to limit the airplane's range. Oil would. For example, in the Thunderbolt, when they increased it from 305 gallons of fuel to 370 internal, they also increased the oil tank. And you could get a case where you had a very worn-out Thunderbolt that could conceivably run out of oil before it ran out of fuel. Now, this wasn't a problem in practice because the theoretical problem of this happening, let's say, was mitigated by taking worn out Thunderbolts and declaring them as war weary and only using them to patrol the English Channel, essentially, to look for down flyers. So through inspections and maintenance programs and intervals for repairs and things, oil capacity, to my knowledge, was never a range limiting factor for the Thunderbolt, but it could be in some obscure cases. Just another consumer. These should be relatively easy to update in the design. Churlo, yeah, exactly, and that's why they did that. They put a bigger oil tank in the longer range Thunderbolts. Red Max 8. Bill, if the 8th Air Force knew that the bombers couldn't fly unescorted, why did they only specify fighters with short range? Yeah, that's exactly right. It's because the reason they only specified fighters with short range is because they truly believed the bombers could fly unescorted at the time they started designing those fighters. Jiro, I don't know. Anyway, it was the bomber mafia's early arrogance. Yeah, that was certainly a problem. Gary Hill, good stuff, nerding out. Glad you like the show, Gary. Count Bugula, putting the P-47 aside. Okay, we can do that for a moment. If the P-38 was capable of the range and they had them in theater at the time, why weren't they used to escort the full distance to the target? Because Hap Arnold sent them to North Africa, and thus the P-38s were not in theater in sufficient numbers. They could have been, yes, that was a choice. They could have sent the Thunderbolts to North Africa and used the P-38s to escort in Europe, had that been a priority, but escort fighters were not a priority. Andrew asks, who is winning? Well, I'm winning. I'm winning. Maybe, some people obviously are going to disagree with that. Bruce says Andrew is winning. Okay, that's funny. Tie thing. All right, let's move on. Gold leader, Bill's internet connection is definitely losing. That's funny. Matthias Gregg is obliterating this poor man with potato internet. Tom, there's a lot being tossed out there as of yet. Nothing earth-shattering, groundbreaking as of yet. Give it a chance. Yeah, good point, Tom. Michael Mayo, Count Bugula, initially unreliable engines at very low temperatures, common in Europe. Kind of true. I mean, I could argue, I suppose, that aircraft piston engines never really got super reliable, not by modern standards anyway. David A., both have great points. Okay. Seems the point of contention is racks versus tanks, as lack of racks is Bill's main point. Well, Bill definitely argues the later racks, the wing racks and the later belly racks. He talks a lot about when they came in, and I don't think his point is valid because it ignores the fact that there were racks earlier. Just because a newer rack or arguably better rack that could carry more things, bombs and stuff, came in later does not mean that the previous rack could not do the job it was designed to, which is take a 200-gallon belly tank, which it certainly could and did. So while Bill is saying things that are true, my contention is that those things don't matter within the context of this discussion. Goodvana, question, if internal fuel was what mattered for the European theater, was there any possibility to increase the internal fuel load of the P-47? Yes, and that was done twice. The P-47 went through many revisions. They came out with a new Thunderbolt roughly every 6 weeks during the war. And during that time, not counting field mods, okay, there were 3 main fuel configurations, 305 gallons internal, 370 gallons internal from the D-25 and later. The D-25s rolled off the assembly line initially early February 44, were in service in Europe May of 44. Now, then later with the November models, they had even more fuel capacity, but we're generally not talking about those right now. Alex, an argument I've heard a couple times is that early P-47s did not have the necessary plumbing to equip drop tanks. At Gregor Bill, do you know if there's any truth to this? Well, like a lot of things, there's some truth to it, but it's really a nonsensical argument. The first combat-ready version of the Thunderbolts, the C2RE, that went into production in September of 1942, and all of those and all subsequent Thunderbolts had provisions to carry drop tanks, all of them. And the D model came out right after that. I think it was less than 4 weeks later after that C2RE. So all of the Thunderbolts, when we're talking about combat variants, had the ability to carry drop tanks. When people bring this point up, They're talking about earlier versions that either never went into combat or in most cases never even went overseas and that were used for training and testing and so forth. Ian says, Greg is winning. I agree. Dennis, careful, Bill. He's an engineer. Dennis, I don't know what you mean. I am technically an engineer, but I am a flight engineer, which is not what people normally mean when they say that you're an engineer. Unity Motorsports Garage. Hey, buddy, I feel Greg is winning. Bill has made some valid points as well. I really like the Unity Motorsports Garage channel. Andy Wood there just does excellent work. Mindblown Watcher says the original large drop tanks were unpressurized and were unsatisfactory. True, provided you're talking about Republic's compressed paper 200-gallon tank. It's unsatisfactory largely because Republic was trying to make it in accordance with the requirements of the USAF leadership. They weren't allowed to pressurize it. That's why it wasn't pressurized. And they built it out of paper mache because they also built a steel 200-gallon tank, but they weren't sure if that was going to be allowable, steel or not. So they hedged their bets and also built a compressed paper tank. And they were smart to do so because that was the one the USAF purchased. The other reasons it was unsatisfactory, and well, unsatisfactory I guess is a relative term, but let's say the other reason it wasn't particularly good is it didn't have baffling in it. It was just intended as a ferry tank, which is what the USAF was asking for. So it did what it was supposed to do, and frankly, I don't know of a better 200-gallon paper mache tank in World War II, so we need to keep that in mind. Dennis Mason, P-38 troubles early on until they worked out the kinks. Yes, that's true. The P-38 was on the leading edge of technology at the time, and they did have a lot of problems, but most of those problems, not all, but most of them were resolved. Just another consumer. Twin engine means undesirable for large numbers anyway, more expensive. Yes, absolutely. Two engines, double the trouble as far as expense, engine expense, propeller expense, maintenance. You've got much more complicated pilot training. You've got logistical headaches because those are two different engines on the P-38. Not only do you have two engines, they're two different engines, two different propellers. It's really a bit of a mess. And as a general rule, you want a single engine propeller driven fighter versus a twin engine propeller driven fighter. There were not very many twin engine prop driven fighters in World War II that were competitive against enemy single engine fighters. Joshua Monson, what was so unsatisfactory about those early tanks? The fact that it was designed to USAF leadership specs, thus no pressurization, and it was made out of paper mache. So they had range in the Pacific Theater of Operations because of adequate drop tanks, but not the range in the European theater because of insufficient drop tanks. Both of those statements are true. That doesn't sound like a design flaw, but rather a bad decision. Yes, the lack of drop tanks in the European theater is entirely due to poor decision making. There was no technical reason they couldn't put drop tanks on the Thunderbolt. Ian, Bomber Mafia, let's make the B-17 with more guns. Republic, ... Yeah, that's about right. Hayden Ray, the pressurization of 47 tanks was easily remedied in the field and not a large obstacle. Absolutely true. It's very, very easy to tap pressurization off of a World War II fighter, especially a Thunderbolt. There are a lot of places to do that. You could take manifold pressure. You could take it right off the supercharger. In the case of the Thunderbolt, they took it from the discharge side of the vacuum pump that drives the gyro instruments. That worked very well. And there's not a whole lot to this. It's basically you tap into your source of pressurization, then you've got a hose, a valve, and not much else. It could be done in the field. These could be retrofitted. Just, again, not an issue. Tom, I don't know if this type of debate has a clear winner. Of course it does, Tom, and it's clearly me. I'm just kidding. But yeah, you have a good point. Ian, incredible, I guess. Thanks, Ian. William Spangler, this is odd to me. One side argues the technical, physical limits. The other side argues logistics that existed at the time. I thought this was a debate on the technical limits and specifications. He says speculation. No, I'm arguing both sides. I'm arguing, A, there is no technical limitation, no technical reason the Thunderbolts could not have had drop tanks before they started flying escort missions in Europe, so January of 1943. There is also no logistical reason they couldn't have done that. We're talking about the United States of America in 1943. The U.S. could build an entire Liberty ship in 30-something days. We could get hundreds of fighter planes across the Atlantic into the European theater. Arguing that you couldn't build and deliver drop tanks when you're doing all of these other things is just ridiculous. Let's move on and turn the page. Just another consumer. It's an engineering challenge, one easily solved with the technology of the 1940s. Yes, solving the problem of putting a drop tank on a Thunderbolt was absolutely trivial, and it was done in very little time, both in the Pacific theater and in the European theater at the local level, and those two operators did that independently of each other. So it was clearly not some sort of insurmountable challenge. Dennis Mason, Betty's, Lola's, Frank's, Japanese aircraft, except maybe the Lola. What is a Lola? Is that a Japanese? I don't think that's a Japanese airplane. Maybe it is. Betty's and Frank's certainly are. Count Bugula, right, but it's not like they weren't using the P-38. They were absolutely being used for escort in the European theater despite their deficiencies up until the switch over to the 51. Okay, they were using P-38s to escort bombers into Germany. However, they were not using P-38s to escort the heavies very often in 1943. And the reason I brought this up in the debate is because if you accept the premise, which is a false premise, but if you accept the premise that there was just no way they could put drop tanks on Thunderbolts, but that the bomber mafia really, really did want to escort those bombers into Germany, they could have used Lightnings. Lightnings had long range and they were available with drop tanks from very early on. But that's not what happened. Hap Arnold sent the Lightnings to the North African theater in the Mediterranean area and kept the Thunderbolts in England. Well, if the Thunderbolts really couldn't carry a drop tank, they could have sent those to North Africa in the Mediterranean theater and kept all the P-38s for bomber escort over Fortress Europe, where the more serious Luftwaffe opposition was going to be encountered. The fact that they didn't do that really proves that the bomber mafia was not truly interested in providing fighter escort to the bombers. I don't see any way around that. Count Bugula, they could have given those P-38s that were already flying drop tanks to have the range to do the job. Yeah, that's true. Lockheed was able to build vast numbers of drop tanks from very early in the war. They tooled up to do that. I've discussed that several times. Dennis Mason, I don't understand your comment. Red Max, it's more technical limits versus policy decisions. Yeah, I think I've touched on that quite a bit. Joshua Monson, Bill mentioned 10,000 feet on ferry flights. Bill, can you enlighten us as to the effects of altitude on range? What would you estimate the optimal altitude for P-47 range? Well, I'll answer that. It depends a lot on the drop tank configuration you're carrying, or if any. It also depends on the model of the Thunderbolt. But as a general rule, about 15,000 feet with a clean airplane, no drop tanks, and about 10,000 feet with drop tanks. But the manuals, especially for the later Thunderbolts, don't differentiate range between 5,000 and even 25,000 feet. So it sort of depends. Paul Woodman, if local guys were looking out, actually, let me go back to that one also from Joshua. A big factor there is going to be the winds. If you're going eastbound into Germany, you're probably going to want to stay up higher to take advantage of tailwinds, and you're probably going to want to come back lower to stay out of headwinds. So in real world practice, the optimal altitude for range has a lot to do with the given conditions on that day. All right, moving back to Paul Woodman. If the local guys were out looking for tanks, so the U.S. Army Air Force wasn't planning missions for long-range escort. That's exactly right. The USAAF was not planning to use fighters for long-range escort at all, and that is why that had to be handled at the local level. Dennis Mason, whilst tens of thousands of bomber crews went down in flames, and then he says, I mean airmen. Yeah, that's exactly right. These mistakes cost a lot of lives. Okay, Ian says the idea that a new build fighter was required to solve something that was a minor engineering hiccup for an existing plane seems like a stretch. Bill has to argue that the bomber mafia would never be what? Oh, I see. Ian continues, would never be deceptive about something that would seriously harm their political or military careers if true. Okay, the first part of that, yeah, absolutely. The idea that building an all-new fighter is required or somehow more simple than adapting drop tanks to a P-47 is utterly ridiculous. Now, the second part, I'm going to say something that's probably not super politically correct. Bill has to argue that the bomber mafia would never be deceptive about something that would seriously harm their political or military careers if true. Well, Bill actually does argue that. He brings up the oath that people at West Point take and stuff. And I disagree. I don't think that high-level military officers are in some bubble of moral superiority hovering above the rest of us. I think that they're subject to the same human nature factors as everybody else, and maybe some small subset of them is more to one end of the scale than the average population. That's probably true, but they're still subject to the same pressures the rest of us are, and yeah, they will absolutely be deceptive to help their careers. Absolutely. Not all of them, but some of them. And this is one of those cases where that happened. Okay, Hayden Ray, tank mounting racks is the crux of Bill's argument, is it not? It's one of them. I wouldn't want to boil his argument down to one thing. Is it time to address whether any tank mount was available or could have been made available in 1942? Yes. In September of 1942, P-47 Thunderbolts starting rolling off the assembly line with a rack to hold a belly tank, a 200-gallon tank. And that's just indisputable. So, I mean, the answer to that is yes. September of 42, all P-47s from that point on had the ability to carry drop tanks. That is not up for debate. What Mr. Marshall is arguing is there seems to be that because a later version of the Thunderbolt had a different rack, that somehow invalidates the earlier version, and I don't see it that way. Radmax, William Spangler, the policy being to intentionally keep the range shorter to push their philosophy that bombers didn't need escorted. I'm going to say that that's actually the other way around. I don't think that the policy was to keep the range short to push their philosophy about bombers being able to self-escort. I think the philosophy about bombers being able to self-escort then pushed the policy to not bother with long-range fighters. So I think that's what you're saying, I think, is actually the other way around, but I suppose ultimately the conclusion is the same. Dennis, P-47, very expensive. Yes, Thunderbolts were very expensive. Lightnings were very expensive. Corsairs were very expensive. P-51s were quite a bit less expensive, and that's one of the brilliance of the P-51 Mustang, is the bang for the buck, so to speak. Also, the F-6F Hellcat falls into that category. It's amazingly inexpensive for what it's capable of doing. All right, just another consumer. Did they ever even try it if they knew the tanks existed from the Pacific Theater of Ops? Well, not really, because by the time the Pacific Theater got those tanks, see, the Pacific Theater got their Thunderbolts relatively late in the war, relative to the European theater. I think August of 43. So by that point, when they came up with their tank, things were already starting to turn around in the European theater. They were coming up with their own solutions. So essentially, no, there were no Pacific Theater tanks in the European theater. However, that concept certainly was tried, the concept of a 200-plus gallon centerline tank. In fact, it's not unusual to see pictures of 56th Group P-47s flying with a 215-gallon centerline drop tank that looks very much like the Pacific Theater tank. And that was desirable because it allowed you to carry quite a bit of fuel, go pretty deep into Germany, but without the wing pylons, which impair performance. So the idea was used over in the European theater, but not the exact tank, at least not as far as I know. Dennis, I don't know what you mean there, but good luck with that. John McGuire, this is just two smart people. Thank you, John. I'm going to tell my kids that somebody on the internet said that I'm smart. Talking past each other. The moderator is supposed to help ask questions to get to the bottom of this. I'm sorry, Greg. I know you put a lot of effort into this. I did put effort into it. Mr. Marshall did as well. This is not the fault of the moderator. The dilemma here is that both people in this debate, myself and Mr. Marshall, presuming what Mr. Marshall wants, I could be totally wrong, but I think that both of us are wanting to get our main points out, and in a limited amount of time. Thus, I didn't want to address every single thing Mr. Marshall said, because a lot of times I think it's more important to make some other point than to offer a retort for one of his points that I don't think has any weight anyway. And I think that both of us were kind of doing that. So, yeah, sorry about that. I've never seen a debate that's not that way. William Spangler at Radmax 8, understood, not, okay. M. Peugeot, the U.S. had zero problems with throwing bodies away for daytime bombing. Personnel were expendable. Well, that's a complicated thing to tackle and really beyond what I do on this channel, but I'm going to touch on it anyway. First of all, compared to what? I'd hesitate to say zero problems. The U.S. had some problems throwing bodies away. Did they have problems doing that as compared to the Soviets throwing away Russians? Or what about the Soviets throwing away Ukrainians? I mean, they were throwing away Ukrainians at a way more recklessly than the U.S. was throwing away air crews. Also, the British throwing away Canadians was a pretty big thing too. So all of the Allies, and the Axis to an extent, but certainly all of the Allies were pretty reckless with throwing people away. But you can make the argument that those losses shorten the war. If the U.S. had done something different, did night bombing, for example, would they have been able to destroy the Luftwaffe, and would D-Day have taken place in June of 44? Would it have been later? Would the war have run on longer? Would more people have died? I don't know. I'm going to let some other channel deal with that. Let's turn the page and move on. Dennis says, Andrew, our moderator, reminisces about his flying days. Andrew has a lot of flying days in front of him. Hopefully, he's a pretty young guy, and he works for a really good airline that if the pilot group doesn't totally screw up their next contract, he should have a good job for a long time. All right, Doc Lig, I don't know how to say that. Debating a fighter from the 1940s, question mark, incredible testament to the enduring legacy of the Jug. Well, I suppose it is, but more importantly here is not the P-47, it's understanding the deceit and treachery and cover-up involved in this whole thing, at least as I see it. There's a saying, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it, or something like that. And a lot of this type of deceit and treachery we see, these mistakes made and then the cover-up of the mistakes, those sort of things still go on today, and it's hard to see it when it's happening, but if you've seen it before, it helps. So I think this is more important than just discussing the range of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Dennis, yeah. Count Bugula. His internal fuel argument doesn't make sense when they still had P-38s with the fuel capacity. Absolutely. Bill was making the argument that the 305-gallon P-47 didn't have the range to go to Schweinfurt or wherever it was at this point in the debate. And even the most conservative arguments, or the most conservative estimates, I should say, give a 450-mile combat radius for escort purposes with a P-47 Razorback, 305 gallons of internal fuel. That gets it to Schweinfurt without any real problem. So this internal fuel argument just doesn't hold any water with me. But then it is completely blown out of the water when you consider the existence of the P-38 Lightning. Because even if the Thunderbolts didn't exist at all, well, they still had P-38 Lightnings that could have escorted to Schweinfurt, but they didn't. And that was a choice. And once again, I don't want to be a broken record on this, but that proves that the bomber mafia was not serious about fighter escorts into Germany. Clark says, spent 12 years in the U.S. Army up to the rank of Major. Well, congratulations, Major. That's a significant rank to attain. Greg is absolutely correct regarding how the leaders are very protective of their doctrine. It's necessarily a malicious intent on their part. It may end up being malicious. I don't think it starts that way. And I'm not sure malicious is the right word. I think a lot of times these people are true believers. In other words, somebody believes that we really need that tank, or we really need that airplane, or we need to pour more money into that missile, or whatever. And that becomes their project and a big part of their career, and they really believe it. It's not only in their self-interest, they also believe it's in the interest of the country or the military or whatever it is that they're doing. And then they tend to be too slow to realize the error of their ways. And I think this is human nature. I think we all do it. Dennis Mason says confession. Not sure what he means. Tom. Okay, so Tom is answering Dennis here. Says Neil Kirby, pilot of Fiery Ginger P-47D4RA. All right, Neil Kirby is a Pacific Theater Thunderbolt ace. I'll talk about him quite a bit in the next two videos that are going to cover the Pacific Theater. He has kind of an interesting story, and he flew 4 different Thunderbolts, all of them Razorbacks. Gigahertz, Bill's audio, yeah, I know. Dennis says, thanks, Tom, for straightening him out on the Neil Kirby thing, I think. Just another consumer. Yup. Oh, he's addressing Gigahertz. We're getting him, talking about getting him drop tanks to improve his range. That's funny. Dennis Mason says, Ginger is my mom's name. Really? Okay, that's cool. Clark says it's not necessarily malicious intent. Oh, I'm glad that Clark said that. So Clark being the Army major from several comments above, and I just addressed this whole thing about how I don't think it's necessarily major, and Clark agrees with me. That makes me happy. Ian, stop saying stuff like that. That's not true. Okay, I'm going to end this at this point. We're only about halfway through these comments, so I'm going to use the other two a little bit later. I'm kind of using these as filler videos because, frankly, these Pacific Theater videos are turning into the longest videos, most in-depth videos I've ever made. Thus, they're taking an unusual time to make. Also, it's harder than you might think to find pictures of P-47 Thunderbolts. There weren't that many Thunderbolts in the Pacific Theater in comparative terms to the other places. And film was not super common in the Pacific Theater. Even things like paint for nose art was not super common in the Pacific Theater. So that makes finding the right pictures much more difficult when I assemble the video. And so that's what I'm doing right now. Anyhow, I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll mention that I have a considerable amount of stuff added to the Patreon section for P-47s, including the Pacific Theater Manual. And in the next video, I will be putting up the receipts for some of the things that I've been saying. For example, proof that the lack of tank pressurization was the result of USAAF leadership's requirements for drop tanks. Proof that Republic did in fact have a metal 200-gallon drop tank. I think that's important because there's some guy out there on some forum somewhere. It's not Mr. Marshall. It's somebody else saying that I made up the existence of that tank. It only exists in my mind or some such nonsense. That's absolutely not true. There are a number of sources, none of them from Republic, all from the USAAF, for the existence of that tank. So that I'm going to absolutely blow that out of the water. And I also have extremely good range data coming up in the next video that I think will be indisputable. And I'm anxious to get that done. So anyhow, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. I'm supposed to say that now. And again, check out my Patreon. I think you're going to find a lot of stuff in there, especially at the captain's level on the P-47. Also, a lot of Pacific Theater stuff that I'm using for the new video is there as well. So again, I'm going to go goodbye and have a great day. And just one more thing, Mr. Marshall really does know the P-51 Mustang extremely well, has some books on that, and I think they're probably worth reading. I plan to read them soon, but I'm waiting for his new book to come out because it's on, and I find this very interesting, it's on the lightweight P-51 Mustangs that were made between the World War II variants that we normally see, the D models, and the H, which is the mostly post-war lightweight airplane. And for the life of me, I can't think of what he's going to write about. I mean, there's not a lot that went on there as far as I know, so there must be a lot that I don't know here. I thought those were just stopgap airplanes in there, but apparently not, because he's writing a whole book about it. I can't wait to read this, and I'll keep you guys updated, but I'm definitely going to read that book and do a review of it, and I'm very excited about it, so I hope you guys will keep an eye out for it as well. Anyway, I'm really leaving now, so that's it. Have a great day.